Greetings, Keith Prather here again with the NCM Automotive Economic Update. Let me share my screen here very quickly. Okay, this month was kind of interesting. We're still looking at May data. That's the latest data that we have available to be able to build the demand index. There's a lot of different components that go into it, and not all the data is updated. So that's typically kind of how this works. But the latest index that we have available showed it coming in at 56.1, which was up a little bit from 55.0. That was a little bit of a surprise headed into obviously the late summer months. We were 2% higher month over month between April and May, and about 6.5% lower still year over year. Remember that this is a forward-looking demand index, so it's almost like a leading economic index. It gives us an idea of what the demand environment will look like 6 months in advance. And I'll be honest with you and tell you that I have a feeling that the demand index is probably a little bit understated right now. I know we're not feeling that with automotive sales at the moment. I know that at the dealership level, we're still under some pressure. We see prices for both new and used cars dropping a little bit. And I know that that pressure is there, but the demand environment, was reacting to maybe the tariff pressures, and we were seeing a little bit of pulled forward sales that would have been pulled forward into March, maybe even to April, and now we're starting to see some softening. We know when we look at sales data, which I'll show you in a couple seconds, obviously those numbers are still down a little bit for the year. Historically, still doing pretty well. But right now, the index itself, the demand forward-looking index, did pop up just a little bit month over month. We'd like to see it stronger and like to see it obviously up in levels, that we may have seen in 2019 or even prior to that. Then as we look at, make sure I have all my, yep, there we go. When we take a look at sales and we look at inventories then, which is sort of the second component, second piece of the story that we want to pay attention to. Sales overall, and this is up through June, sales were about 1.8% lower year over year. And they did fall sharply month over month. They came in at about 15.3 million units annually. But it's only a couple months ago that we saw them at 17 million units. You can see that over here. So even though they dropped, we're still, not at levels that we saw coming out of the pandemic. This is not 2007 or 2008 levels, not even 2010 levels. But it is a little bit below where we were prior to the pandemic in the first Trump term, and obviously a little bit lower than we were, before the Great Recession. Inventories are kind of interesting because we're still 35% lower on inventories relative to sales than we were prior to the pandemic. And right now we're still cruising 4.2% lower than we were even last year. But they did increase month over month. And so we're watching that combination of a drop in sales and an increase in inventories. And that does create just a little bit of concern. But I'm going to explain to you why it's not. Hold on just a moment. So when we look at broader US macroeconomic activity, what we're seeing in Q2 is a little better than we had expected. We're getting a 2.6% macroeconomic growth rate. This is GDP. Blue chip analysts were cruising along at about 1%. They thought, hey, things are looking pretty lackluster in Q2. But even as they saw economic data roll in, they were convinced that they needed to increase their outlook. And so they've even got their outlook for Q2 higher at about 2%. It's much higher than what the Federal Reserve is predicting. But there is still some forecasts that show a fairly weak or fairly, I want to say flat and lackluster second half of the year. And I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case. But right now for Q2, again, coming in at 2.6, which is a little bit hotter than expected. So our forecast for retail, when we think about just retail in general, which includes automotive and a lot of other factors, but most importantly, it gives us an idea of whether the US consumer is still healthy and still looking for opportunities, or whether US consumers pulling back and starting to sit on their hands a little bit. And so what we see is still a forecast for a pretty healthy retail consumer spending forecast for the second half of the year and into 2026. And when you look at it on a historical basis, you still see it's well outpacing the long-term average, and that growth rate is still very, very strong overall. Um, this has a pretty good accuracy rate. We feel pretty confident about the model, at least for now. And again, we do these month over month. And so as we start to see adjustments in the economy, this curve will either flex and show upward bias and get pushed higher, or we'll see it adjust and pull lower. But for now, again, this shows a good, stable consumer environment for now. Automotive production then is still fairly flat. We did see again the inventory building activity. We do have the tariff pressures at hand. And so we're not getting a real strong signal out of automotive production until about the beginning of 2026. And then all of a sudden we get a surge. And you can see it over here a little bit better. And you can see that at least this year, even though it looks fairly flat, it's still significantly going to feel significantly better than where we were last year. And then we get that surge at the end of the year and you see the production go up. We just got industrial production numbers and it looks like we're going to see just a little bit of softening in this curve, but nothing overly dramatic. It looks like tariff pressures are something that OEMs are working through. But once they're able to get suppliers to the point where they're getting stronger foreign discounts and a little bit of discount up and down the supply chain, especially in transportation costs, that I think you'll start to see this curve improve a little bit. And I think we'll see OEMs maybe cranking out more units as we get closer to the end of the year. And here's the real primary reason why I think that's going to happen. So this is the new, this is funny, but this is the official name of the bill. It's the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, right? And it was passed in July. You're all aware of it. Forget for a moment the impact on the deficit over the next 10 years or so. We need to look at the impacts here and now and what's going to happen from a stimulus perspective based on passing the bill. There's a lot of noise up here. Don't pay attention to a lot of this. Basically, it's just an illustration to show you how many different areas there are going to be tax benefits extended to consumers. So all the way up and down the income scale, all the way up and down the age scale, you're going to see benefits all the way across the spectrum. When we take all these cuts and all these benefits and you really boil them down, what it comes down to is this. We are likely to see a $7,600 average net benefit per household by the time we get to the end of the tax year, which will be, obviously file our taxes sometime next April. You should start to see those benefits then. And a lot of consumers will realize it at that point in time. And that's when you may start to see a lot of automotive spending, a lot of adjustments really start to kick in. Yeah, dividing that by 12, you've got about $500 to $600 per month that most households would see as a benefit to be able to put toward maybe the payment on a larger vehicle or some other big ticket item. This is going to be a consistent theme across all of our sectors for NCM, across this month. This was big news. We think it boosts retail spending and consumer spending overall by about $781 billion starting in the calendar year 2026. We'll start to see just a little bit of that benefit. There's an economic term that we call animal spirits. And animal spirits kick in when you and I feel really good about our financial situation or we feel good about the future. And before we get an actual benefit coming to us, we'll go out and spend existing cash that we have on hand. So spend it from savings or we'll go borrow or do other things. But we want to get ahead of that wave. And animal spirits, at some point in time, based on this information and this knowledge that's coming to a lot of households, those animal spirits will start to kick in and we will see spending between now and the end of the year that we weren't expecting when the actual tax benefit may not hit until 2026. So especially if you have some households who are on the edge, they're thinking about buying a new vehicle, but they've just been hesitating or waiting. Now that they've got this news and they can see what this benefit looks like, I think a lot of them may hit showroom floors once again. The other thing is then we just look at the macroeconomic forecast and the Federal Reserve has still got us for the full year pretty weak, somewhere between 1.5, 1.4 to 1.5%. I think it could be a little bit north of that, but there are a lot of tariff scenarios out there. We believe that what we call a tariff scenario one will happen, which is that the average tariffs across the board will come in somewhere between 12 and 15%. And at that point in time, we're looking at actual growth this year of about 1.5, and then next year they would get a little bit closer to 2%, maybe even over 2%. but that's kind of where we are. So I think if I were going to summarize this, I think in general we are going through a bit of a soft patch right now. It's been building for a couple months, tariff pressure, trade pressure, just some uncertainties in the economy. We're building, and so we see consumers and businesses kind of sitting on their hands. But since the beginning of the month, with the new tax bill being passed, with some trade deals being seen, with some fairly tame inflation, at least at the moment, tariffs are likely to get passed on later on. It's another story. Uh, we're seeing at least the potential for the consumers to kind of come out of hibernation and maybe a better second half of the year. And so that's kind of where we're going to rest, kind of the moral of the story and where the forecast is. I do think, we are going to see some benefits. And so I would say stay resilient, stay a little bit conservative for another month or so until we really fully understand the impact of tariffs and what those final trade deals look like. But I would say that everything is pointing toward a better better end of the year, and then a much better 2026 trajectory. So it's based on what we know today. Things change rapidly, and we could be singing a different tune tomorrow. But for now, that's what we have. So until next month, stay resilient, and we'll talk to you soon. All right, take care.